Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. This is Brussels calling, so to say. My name is Heiko Borchert. I'm working as a strategic affairs advisor, and I'm really happy to welcome you for today's online seminar that we're organizing, the European Movement International and the Raiffeisen Bank International, on a very topical subject. I'm very happy to welcome with me three distinguished experts who will join me for the next 60 minutes to talk about a changing geoeconomic environment and the impact of this changing geoeconomic environment on business in particular. I would first of all like to welcome from Moscow Dmitry Trenin, who is, hello Dmitry, who is heading Carnegie's office in Moscow. He's also chairing the Foreign Security Policy Program of the institution. And in a second, he will talk about Russia's perspective on this changing geoeconomic environment. Dmitry will be joined by our second speaker. This is Thomas Wieser, an economist. Hello, Thomas. An economist by training and the former chairman of the Eurogroup working group. He will share with us the European perspective on this changing geoeconomic environment and to what extent this might impact also Europe's strategic leeway in what seems to become a pretty contested environment, also contested in terms of various different aspects we're going to discuss today. And last but not least, I'm very happy to welcome Alexander Pizaruk. Hello, Alexander. He's the chairman of the board of Raiffeisen Bank Aval in Kiev, Ukraine. He used to be the deputy chairman of the National Bank of Ukraine, and he also spent 3 years at the International Monetary Fund. So you see, we have a broad expertise around the table. Policy expertise, practitioners' expertise, financial and corporate expertise in particular. And we strongly believe that this broad set of perspectives is necessary as we talk about the dawn of a new phase in international affairs. That geoeconomic competition we are likely to see over the next couple of years will presumably be quite different from the past. We clearly see that the fabric of the international system is changing. There are different domestic political preferences in Western and non-Western countries. This affects not also their policies, but also the way they deal with their businesses. And then finally, and this in a way has been the talk of town, so to say, connectivity, which has been the glue in the past for a global business outlook as well, connectivity is becoming increasingly toxic. And this is something we would like to discuss in more detail with all three of our experts, but of course also with you in the audience. You see all the tools you have to join us. If you have questions, if you would like to participate in a discussion, use the tools that are available. Today, we would like to start our discussion with Dmitry's view from Moscow. Dmitry just recently wrote a very interesting paper reflecting on Russia's new security strategy, where he made the point that this is not an ordinary update of a political capstone document. Rather, Dmitry's point was it is a kind of manifesto for a new era. A new era also of sustained competition between the West and Russia. And of course, we're eager to learn more, Dmitry, from your perspective. What do you see as the main messages of the national security strategy? And why is this document important to understand for a non-Russian audience?
Well, thank you, Heiko. First of all, it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel, and I thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. Maybe this phrase "manifesto for a new era" sounds a bit highfalutin, But in reality, it is something that looks beyond the usual ingredients of a national security strategy, which usually in Russia, and I would say in a number of other countries, was focused on the traditional security, military, geopolitical issues. I think that in the view of the Russian leadership, which is reflected in this strategy, the most important area for Russia in terms not only of its position in the world, but in terms of its own cohesion domestically, is non-military. So the most important things are economic, technological, information, and other non-military issues. Not that military issues do not matter, but from the standpoint of the Kremlin, the principal tasks in that field have been achieved in the last decade or so. Russia is again perceived as a major player around the world, major independent power, not a superpower like the United States and China, but still a country that matters. It has rebuilt its military might. So now there are new challenges, and these new challenges, energy and climate in particular, the transition that the energy industry is going to take. These things are going to shape Russia's future as they will shape the future of the world.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I think that's a very important message up front. That what is really important to understand about this new document is the non-military part. So the geoeconomic part, in a sense. And when you say that also the big challenges that Russia is preparing for are really the impact of a changing energy policy, in particular in the European Union, but also perhaps the union's expectations, how you should step up national efforts in this endeavor to protect the global climate. To what extent can you already foresee how these two trends, energy policy, climate policy, might affect Russian policy?
Oh, they will affect not just Russia's policy, but a lot of other things inside Russia. This energy transition coincides, just think of it, with the political transition in Russia, which is moving slowly, but it's moving inexorably to a post-Putin period. And clearly, nothing is more important for the Russian elite than managing carefully that transition to a goal that would satisfy the elite. Of course, the elite is not all Russia, and there are other quarters, other strata that have their own views about the transition and many aspects of Russian domestic, particularly domestic situation. So it's going to be difficult, tricky, and hugely, immensely important. But let me also say that for a country like Russia, energy industry, although it does not occupy the entire ground of the Russian economy, is extremely important for its primarily for its dealings with the rest of the world, starting with Europe. And with Europe coming up with its own Green Deal, the United States under the Biden administration setting its own goal in the climate area, China talking about carbon neutrality by 2060. In fact, the entire world, including all the major trading partners of Russia, going in the same direction of carbon neutrality. You have to think very seriously about where you are going yourselves, whether you will be left behind by the roadside, or whether you will be part of this trend. So that is, as I said, that is very, very important. I would compare the task of managing the energy transition in Russia to the task, in terms of foreign policy, to the task of achieving strategic parity and strategic stability in relations with the United States in the 1970s. It's a task of a similar caliber.
That's an extremely interesting comparison that you make between the traditional defense-minded world or the geopolitical environment and this new geoeconomic environment. And listening to what you just said with regard also to the transition that the country is in from President Putin to a post-Putin world. In the last several years, Russia's economy has been surprisingly resilient, not vis-a-vis also Western sanctions. In this transition process, do you think that resilience is going to be a strategic asset for Russia also to withstand pressure from the outside? Or are there already indicators that a post-Putin Russian system might look different?
Well, it depends. As far as the last question is concerned, it depends how far beyond Mr. Putin's formal reign you look. So there may be several stages in transition, but certainly the country is not standing still. That is for sure. And resilience is a trademark of Russia's economic policy. I think it's based on a solid macroeconomic policies that Mr. Putin has been supporting throughout. He is often criticized within Russia, obliquely or directly, of supporting liberals in his cabinet who insist on sound macroeconomics. A lot of people would have none of that. But that is the basis on which he has been able to achieve the degree of resilience that we've been discussing. The other side of that story, of course, is that resilience sits side by side with the inability to grow, inability to develop fast. Russia's economic growth has been abominable, and you may say that Russia has lost a decade, if not more, of let's say, solid economic growth. It has been anemic, if anything. There have been recessions along the way. So, and that led to the dip in living standards of the population, which people intensely dislike around the country. So you can celebrate, I mean, as a Russian, you can celebrate resilience, but you should put it into a broader context of slow to non-existent growth and very uneven development. Those are the challenges that the Russian economy is facing. It's not just an economic issue. It's an issue of political economy. It's an issue of a high degree of monopolization. It's an issue of bureaucracy and corruption and a lot of other things. And they all come together to form, a very varied picture of today's Russia.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. I'm sure we will be coming back to this obvious ambivalence between a resilient economic system on the one hand and what you says as a low growth or no growth economic environment. I'd like to continue our discussion with Thomas and picking up what Dimitri said about resilience. In your paper, Thomas, that you wrote also for a forthcoming volume that Raiffeisen Bank International is publishing on this future geoeconomic environment, you also look into the growing technology competition. These days, technology is more or less at the forefront of the geoeconomic competition between various countries and also regions. And as you reflect upon your very long career also with stints at the European level, I wonder whether you could enlighten us on how and why technology all of a sudden comes center stage in this competitive environment, and to what extent technology competition could either strengthen or undermine Europe's resilience, and perhaps also shed light on the transatlantic perspective with the new Trade and Technology Council, where the European Union and the United States seem willing to address these technology issues and also prepare themselves for an environment which is going to look different than we've gone through in the past. Thomas.
Okay, thanks very much, Heiko, for this. Maybe in order to provide some perspective, if we just take a couple of steps backwards and see how these issues have developed, not over the years, but over the decades, we, of course, and especially and even on the European continent, have had a long history of systemic competition. And system or 1990, whichever year you wish to choose. But the noteworthy thing is that systemic divergence had comparatively little effect on trade, because there was comparatively little trade between, if you so want to style it, East and West. There were certain limitations on dual-use goods and the like, but essentially, you didn't have to resort, or countries did not greatly have to resort to trade restricting measures because there was that little. Then came what, in retrospect, we probably would call the boom years of globalization from the early 90s onwards, and a very strong belief that this would lead to systemic convergence. And I don't even have to refer to hopes of some people and sociologists and political scientists who proclaimed the end of history. Essentially, we were in a politological Goldilocks environment, and also Goldilocks economy, and systems would converge. We'd all become market economies, some more democratic, some less democratic. And on the back of that, one of the most important issues in international trade of the last decades was that China joined the WTO, and thus nearly automatically, in due course, gained the status of a market economy. However, then, third phase, we are in the midst, or probably only at the beginning, of a next phase of systemic competition, albeit in an environment of very, very close and enormous trade linkages between the systemic rivals, and the hegemon on one side and the emerging, possibly duopolist hegemon on the other side. And that is increasingly leading to trade being subservient to politics. In former times, for very many countries, foreign policy and security policy served the furthering of trade linkages and investment linkages. And nowadays, it seems we are in a phase where trade linkages are subservient and are being instrumentalized for security reasons, foreign policy reasons, and the like. And this, of course, is also driven by a process of systemic divergence instead of the systemic convergence people were hoping for 30 and 20 years ago. Inter alia, because quite clearly, in many aspects, even though China may be a capitalist economy, it is not a market economy in the sense that many had hoped. Think, for example, of the balance sheet of state-owned enterprises. Think of intellectual property aspects, and so on. So the question which is before us, and this is especially for Europe, an incredibly important question. If we want to continue to trade at more or less the same level as we do today, we need a rules-based system, very often repeated, but not wrong, despite the repetitions. If you have strong rules, fairly clear rules, you need an institution, a governance structure. You need an institution that houses these rules. And you need to make sure that people play by the rules, or if they don't play by the rules, that there is a legal or judicial mechanism of oversight and redress. So that is fine as long as these economies are pretty similar. But increasingly, I think we've found that certain countries find that the international rule system simply doesn't fit their economies. Are state aid rules, for example, of the WTO, are they fit for purpose to deal with US companies, European companies, and Chinese and Russian companies? Increasingly, the feeling was that not. Big question number one, therefore. Will we be over the next 10, 20, 30 years, will we continue to sit responsible for the governance? Or because of the systemic divergence that we're seeing, this is in part security driven, will we be seeing a development of two alternative sets of rules? If there are two alternative sets of rules, one immediately develops alternative institutions. And I don't think I have to explain in any great detail what the implications, what the ramifications would be for global trade and our trade linkages. And these things, these issues, they go well beyond what we grew up with, the elderly amongst us grew up with, where trade was predominantly trade in manufactured goods. Today, especially in Europe and other Western economies, not only there, trade is increasingly in services. Trade is digital. Trade is technology. And I don't think we need to discuss at great length what the different characteristics are. They are, inter alia, very much driven by what are the standards of these products, what are the standards of these services, where are they written, how are they governed? And that is why it is so important for us in Europe to be able to continue to develop and co-develop standards for emerging technologies, and to make sure that they are applicable, ideally, at a global scale. So these are some of the big questions with which we will be dealing over the coming years and decades. And the question is, does Europe, which has a very, very clear trade policy, which has at the center here in Brussels a strong mechanism to deal with these trade issues, but on the other hand, we have, let's say, 27 divergent security interests, security policies. How can we ensure that we are not between a rock and a hard place, between the US on the one hand, which has a unified trade and a unified security policy, and China, which has a unified trade and a unified security policy? So how can Europe maintain its important position in the world of trade, in the world of security, in these changing times. And there, of course, Heiko was asking about the Tech Council. It potentially can play an important role, because if the US and the European Union can agree on converging, ideally in the future identical, but let's at least say converging standards in the technology field, then there is a good chance that these standards, to which we are also democratically accountable, can become very widespread, ideally global standards. That's the positive way of looking at it. Experiences with our US friends and the cooperation has not always been very rosy over the past couple of years. So let's hope that we can converge not only in, let's say, on paper, but also in fact and in finally reaching agreements across a very wide spectrum of policies. And I'll stop here, Heiko.
Thank you, Thomas. If I may, I'd like to dig deeper a bit on this rules-based discussion that you kicked off. Arnold Bradford, a couple of months ago, wrote a widely read book on the so-called Brussels effect, which she calls, and I quote, the ability of the European Union to deploy market forces to unleash its unilateral global regulatory power. End of quotation. Listening to what you just said, the Brussels effect clearly goes hand in hand with also the projection of economic power, which again goes hand in hand with a global economic and trade regime. Now that we might be on the verge of a more perhaps regional overall regime, where different regions try to set standards also to unleash their market force, from your experience, would you foresee a radical need for change in the way the European Union, and in particular the Commission, of course, looks at regulatory policy? Or do you think that the path forward is already clearly visible, and the Commission and the European Union, and of course in the end also the member states, only need to adjust this existing regulatory approach on details? So the question is radical change versus gradual development into the future when we talk about regulatory policy and its effect on technology development.
Yeah, well, it's not easy to answer, and of course, all forecasts are quite uncertain, especially if they're dealing with the future, as the saying goes. It of course depends to the extent to which Europe can maintain its sort of standard setting importance globally, depends on the importance, on the one hand, of Europe as a market for these goods, and secondly, of course, as a producer of goods and services in these sectors. And if you look at the period from 1990 to 2000 and say 2010, Europe's relative position globally was surely higher in this respect than I would expect it to be in the 2020s and 2030s because of growth elsewhere. Now, if Europe has a strong position in sort of modern technologies, then there is also a strong presumption that the standards it is setting have a fairly strong global effect, or at least well beyond the European Union. But if the dominant places where innovation happens and is transformed into products is China and the United States, there is a much weaker presumption that Europe as such is then the standard setter of choice. So it all depends also on how technological innovation happens on the European continent. Secondly, then, it depends very much on how this process of innovation on the ground is transported into writing regulation here in Brussels. And that is an issue where we critically must say we are not the most nimble. Some things simply take very, very long, and not necessarily only because it takes quite a time for 27 member states to agree, but also because then on top of that comes, of course, a lengthy process of negotiations within and then with the European Parliament. So if we were able to somehow fast track some of these processes, I think that would be a prerequisite for maintaining some of our position in the world. That was factor number 2. Lastly, factor number 3, how are many of these standards transferred then into global standards? Some pragmatically, simply because you export the stuff, and anybody who wants to export stuff to Europe has to produce these things which follow the same standards. But importantly, we are also talking about issues within the domain of the World International Patent Organization. And there, both the United States and Europe have shown a spectacular lack of interest in the processes there, in the policies, in staffing issues. And I think over the next 10, 20 years, we will see the result of this spectacular lack of interest. So strengthening Europe's role, strengthening the US role in WIPO would be one important aspect. And pars pro toto, this goes for many of the standard setting organizations and institutions worldwide.
Thank you, Thomas, in particular also for reminding us of the important issue of staffing organizations properly if you want to really develop your standardization power, because in the end, somebody needs to run the processes to come up with new standards and also perhaps to defend these standards against status quo actors. Listening to what Dimitri said and what you said, Thomas, makes me curious, Alexander, from the corporate perspective. We have been talking about a geoeconomic environment that is most likely much more volatile than in the past. Elements of this volatility can hardly be foreseen. It's difficult to look into preparedness levels if you don't really know what you're preparing for. So on the one hand, volatility is a burden. On the other hand, volatility can also become a force for good. No? It creates room for flexibility, and the question really is who is able to size flexibility. So from your perspective as the chairman also of one of Ukraine's leading international banks, what are the consequences of this geoeconomic environment for companies that need to operate in this environment, from your perspective?
Hi, thank you for this important question. Ukraine, like many other countries, is definitely impacted by the changing geoeconomic environment, and all the companies operating in the countries will have to adapt. We, as a leading and the largest international bank in Ukraine, also have to adapt. And the way we do so is predominantly by focusing on the industries which we believe are at least relatively more resilient towards the change in the geoeconomic environment. In the Ukraine, those industries, for example, include agricultural industry, telecoms, IT, food, retail, So we work with other industries, but we try to focus our business strategy on those which we believe are more resilient. The second thing we do is we apply our advanced risk management framework to monitor also geoeconomic risks which are coming up. So we have a very stringent system of sector limits, individual borrower limits, and we also try to monitor our clients and borrowers in terms of their supply chain, if they're too exposed to counterparties or suppliers in particular country, and how their supply chains could be impacted by the changes in the geoeconomic environment. Last but not the least, we are in the midst of a major digital transformation of the bank, and as you know, in these days, all traditional banks are involved into this. This is a matter of strategic success in the longer term perspective for all the banks in the world. But also what is important here, we believe that agile technological bank and more agile business model is also more adaptable and more resilient to the changes in the geoeconomic environment. It's simply easier and faster adaptable to any changes in the external environment in principle. So these are major elements of our sort of adaptability approach towards the changes of the geoeconomic environment.
Thank you very much. I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about agility as a response to the changing environment, because agility in the end is, well, of course, it is about processes, it is about the institutions, but in the end, it's also about culture and ideas. And when you say that you're monitoring also the risk exposure of the industry sectors that you consider fairly resilient from a Ukrainian perspective, and that you monitor the resilience of the companies you're dealing with, what else can you provide to companies when they really have to deal with geoeconomic risks that materialize in their balance sheet? One thing is a risk that could emerge. Another thing is a risk that really materializes in the balance sheet. Companies might, on the one hand, prepare to enter new markets where they need to take different risks. This is also what Thomas and Dimitri talked about. The state-owned enterprises as competitors might have a completely different risk appetite than commercially run companies. So is your bank in a way perhaps transforming into a more strategic partner for your clients, in that you really help them understand what is going on, help them mitigate the risks, and also provide specific services in how they deal then once these risks materialize?
Well, Heiko, you somehow managed to outline the future of banking in one simple question, right? So, and banking, successful banking is actually a great relationship with its clients, which means engagement. Engagement means we talk. We talk with our clients. We see what the issues are coming. We share our economic analysis and probably geoeconomic analysis. We see outline to them potential risks that we could see, and then we get engaged in a conversation how they could adapt to those risks. And as a bank, we could provide advice more specific to a banking business, being this, for example, in ESG area or in any sort of transition to a green energy or any sort of the traditional banking business issues. But we also basically provide finance to them. So we basically discuss where it's all going, where it could be good to adjust supply chains to make changes in the business model. And then those changes normally need to be financed, and we provide finance in the same time. So this is basically how we deal with the clients in this environment.
I think you also touched upon an issue that is very relevant for all the four of us, and that's the question of how public and private sectors will deal with each other when we look into this emerging geoeconomic environment. And I'm wondering from your perspective, Alexander, and then I'd like to also hear Dimitri's and Thomas's view on this. this famous public-private partnership. Well, everybody really talks about the public-private partnership. Sometimes there's really also substance to rhetoric. From your perspective in Ukraine, is there a specific role that the financial sector could play as a kind of trusted framework or trusted partner to bring companies and the public sector together to really not only identify the challenges out there, but also reflect on how you're going to respond to these challenges?
Thank you, Heike. I think so, actually. I do believe personally that the banks could play a role in this, but first of all, we need to develop detailed principles of trusted partnership to make sure that those principles are still in line with all the legal requirements for banking secrecy and data information exchange. I do believe it's doable, possible. There could be different constructs used for this. But once, and Raiffeisen Bank International is one of the leading banks in Central and Eastern Europe and also in Ukraine, could play a role in fine-tuning these trusted partnership principles. But then, of course, the implementation is key. And here, what is very important as the constant engagement and dialogue with authorities, with the governments, with the regulators in every country we operate. I have to say that we, as a leading international bank in Ukraine, have excellent engagement, communication with the government, with the central bank, with the regulators. So I do believe once we fine-tune and clarify all the sensitive issues around the implementation of trusted partnership, we could successfully roll out this concept in Ukraine.
If I may turn to Dimitri, from your perspective, Dimitri, and from what you said at the beginning, also with regard to the resilience of the economic sector in Russia, but also given the fact that you have, in a way, the tensions inside your own domestic sector, with really commercially run companies and state-owned companies. Is this a level playing field? Is this an environment where, and I think this is something that you were writing also in your paper, where perhaps the government is more confident of directly reaching out to state-owned companies rather than free-floating companies, quote unquote. So from your perspective, is the way the public and private sectors deal with each other in Russia, is this a reason for the country's resilience? And if it is it going to stick with us for the future as well?
Well, I think it's, my answer would be affirmative. Yes, this is one of the reasons for the resilience of the economy faced with outside challenges such as many waves of sanctions, continuing waves of sanctions. As to the level playing field, I don't think that this exists in Russia, frankly. What does exist instead is sort of a system in which whether you are state-owned, whether you are majority privately owned, your position in the country's political economy and, let's say, on the market depends very much on what sort of relations you've managed to fix and maintain with those who call the shots. On really big issues, the Kremlin calls the shots in a very loud and very visible and audible manner. In a way, Russia is turning into, or has already turned into, something that you might call Russia Incorporated. So you may be technically a majority privately owned company, but you cannot afford to ignore the signals or recommendations or whatever coming your way from the Kremlins. It's an economy that is getting more, to use a French word, dirigiste all the time. It doesn't matter that much at the lower rungs of the economic system. But once you reach a certain level, in terms of your size, in terms of your impact, your importance, you're very much part of Team Russia. Let's put it that way. And it's again, it's a country where property and power are very closely intermingled, intersecting all the time. So something like, not exactly what you have in China, and I'm not an expert on the political economy, even of Russia, not to speak of China. But in many ways, Russia is acting on the global economic scene to the extent it acts there as very much one player. And the signals that drive that player come from not necessarily from the Kremlin directly, but certainly from the Russian government and backed by the Kremlin.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'd like to pick up this line of policy becoming more dirigiste and try to turn this towards Thomas, because in a way this return of big government, governments are back in, governments will play a more perhaps assertive role. If we contrast this increasingly more important role of an interventionist government with the Brussels effect that we also discussed before, I'm wondering to what extent there might be an obvious tension between the need to reach out to the corporate sector in order to fully develop this European regulatory power on the one hand, and on the other hand, perhaps this more dirigist approach on the same subject. So from your perspective, is there a role for companies to play an active role in this regulatory power game, or are we going to see a silent takeover of this regulatory power by the governments stepping in ever more detail and perhaps also limiting corporate leeway in certain sectors?
Well, as we know, Europe is a large church. If you look at the differences of the role that the state or governments or certain government actors play, if you compare Luxembourg and France and Germany and Hungary to each other, you see huge differences there. So I think it's very difficult to generalize. What we have seen over the last, call it 2 years, is a reassessment of the role that the state plays in the economy, that governments play in the economy. And if you so want, it is sort of turning many people's back towards what was rightly or wrongly called the Washington Consensus. And there were quite many governments also in Europe who had the feeling that the less the government interfered in the private sector and in the economy, the better for growth and jobs and so on. And increasingly, there's been a realization that there is a better and more fruitful interaction of the two, that a more active government, a more active state sector necessarily has to play an enabling role for innovation and the like, which goes very well beyond the provision of infrastructure or basic financing for research and innovation. So to me, that is probably the most important sea change that we're witnessing right now. And just incidentally, if you go to the website of the G7 presidency of the United Kingdom, you will find a report on global resilience there, which quite extensively deals with this question, and which is quite innovative, I think. And as to the other part of your question, Heiko, again, it is difficult. It is difficult to make too many generalizations there. I think we all have to work on being more simple, caring less about what in regulations is behind the comma, focus more on the big and the medium picture, and not try to be super perfect, thus being nimbler, thus making life easier for each of us as consumers, for example. If I think of the catastrophe and that has been produced in every bank across Europe in terms of bureaucracy for dealing with anti-money laundering, think of all the trees that are being chopped down on a minute-by-minute basis just to provide, and it's all paper, just to provide all the forms that you require as a very simple customer. It is quite incredible. And there, I think the legislator, the co-legislators in Brussels have gone totally overboard and nearly bananas in placing this burden also on me as an individual consumer and a consumer of banking services. So that's something we in Brussels need to think about much more clearly and make it something like a morning star to which we should aspire instead of paying a fairly empty lip service to facilitation, etc. So that's what I would have to say on this issue.
Thank you, Thomas. I think what you just said with regard to also perhaps the regulatory overburden is a nice opportunity also to reach out to one of our participants from the audience, and it's a question from the Secretary General of the European Women Lawyers Association. And I think this question, of course, goes to all of us, but in particular, I would say to Alexander. And the question is, and I quote, will the various Basel requirements in their respective versions, increasing anti-money laundering legislations and other issues, lead to a substantial change of banking business models, as there are male and female business leaders wondering if they should stay in the business of fully licensed banks? So this, in the end, is the question right to the top. To what extent is regulation increasing or decreasing the attractiveness of specific business models? Is this something that you feel comfortable in answering, Alexander?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for a very interesting question. And in my personal opinion, the women should definitely stay in the business of fully licensed banks. We in RBI generally, and particularly in Raiffeisen Bank Ukraine, are active proponents of gender diversity. We actually have amazing diversity in the bank, from the board, management board down throughout the whole organization. And what we know is that the diverse teams are simply more effective, more productive, they're more successful. This is a proven track record of this, and we promote diversity in our policies. I'm less sure that the changes, implementation of Basel standard and IML requirements will have a major impact on the business model. But as I said, diversity needs to be there for many reasons, and the results will be simply a more effective, more productive, more successful banks. So I would very much incentivize women to stay in the business of the licensed banks.
I'd like to stay with this diversity aspect, but give it a bit of a different spin, and going back to what we were discussing before about an increasingly competitive technology space. So where all of a sudden we really compete for technologies. And one of the lessons to be learned out of this COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has been to diversify your sources much stronger than in the past. But this, of course, raises obvious question. For example, Dimitri, from Russia's perspective, looking into technology cooperation with perhaps China, or looking into technology cooperation with the Arab Gulf regions. There are always two sides to the equation. On the one hand, you can say, yes, these are attractive partners that help us diversify our relations. On the other hand, there is also an obvious risk exposure when you go into developing technology with some of the Arab Gulf nations, or China in particular. What's the mood in Moscow when it comes to this? So balancing some risks that emanate from the West with deepening technology cooperation in the South and in the East, is this a model for the future?
Well, I think this is a model for the present. The model for the future would be Russia developing its own technologies. In fact, one of the biggest losses in Russia's post-Soviet history has been the collapse of its near collapse or partial collapse, whatever you want to, however you want to qualify that, of Russia's formerly formidable technological sector. And now that the import of high technology from Western countries is becoming increasingly more problematic for a number of reasons. It's becoming much smaller, and what you get is not regarded to be secure enough or reliable enough. So you have to turn to those in the technological world who are outside of the West, who would not follow US sanctions, who would not fear collaborating with Russia, because dealing with Russia does mean very often having to deal with the United States in an unpleasant way. So yes, for now you have to increase your technological exposure to China. This is what Russia, I think, is doing in a number of areas. Trying to maintain the technological links that still exist with Western countries. With regard to the Arab world, I think it's less about technology and more about investment. Mm-hmm. The technological potential of those countries is not as significant, except for Israel, which is in the region, but it's clearly not an Arab country. So you have to deal with the things that are available to you. It's not a very good situation for Russia, and as I said, there's no long-term alternative to Russia using its still significant potential in terms of human capital, the technological base or what's left of it that was left by the Soviet Union to develop technologies of its own. That's the way to the future. But it is very much an uphill struggle for Russia.
Picking up on the uphill struggle, Alexander, I think what also became quite clear from our discussion, if you want, your attractiveness is an obvious, as a country, your attractiveness is an obvious currency that you need to take care of, because diversification is a two-way street. Your national economy might want to diversify, but this diversification, of course, depends on partners' readiness to also engage in cooperation with you. From your perspective over the Ukrainian industry sectors, where are Ukraine's competitive advantages that the country and also the companies could use perhaps to make valuable contributions to the value chains of the partners they seek cooperation with?
Thank you, Heike. I actually do believe that Ukraine could be a good alternative for companies which consider adjusting or reallocating their supply chain. The country traditionally has a well-educated labor force. The cost of labor has increased over the recent years, but it's still below most other countries. We have a very developed world-class IT industry and the level of digitalization, which is better than many other countries in Central and Eastern Europe particularly. We have improving road infrastructure due to the very large-scale government road construction program. And we basically have improvements also in the transport and logistics infrastructure, like ports, mail, postal services. So if you combine all of this, I think this is a more or less attractive package for companies who consider relocating their supply chain, basically.
Thank you, Alexander. I think it's interesting that you're referring in particular to supply chains, because there is, going back to what Dimitri also said with regard to the Arab Gulf nations, if you're following the investment policies of DP World, for example, which are obviously interested also in closing gaps and in bridging regions, you clearly see that the narrative you have just described is already picking up in the markets, and that some actors are already seeing this potential that Ukraine obviously offers. As we are already a bit over time, I'd like to conclude our discussion with a question to you, Thomas, that came from our participants, Bart Keed in particular. And I'll read the question because I think it really ties nicely into your previous statements. And the question is, I quote, "As multinational companies rooted outside the domestic and regulatory jurisdiction of the European Union, how does the European Union plan to put a leash on big tech that absorbs traditional executive government roles?" So in a way, it's a combination of both trends we have been discussing. Non-European companies and their regulatory power, and the question of in the end, also the extraterritorial application of this regular power vis-à-vis companies that originate from a different region. Any insights from your experience, Thomas, that you'd like to share with us?
Well, there are three and more possible ways of looking at this question. One aspect is the question of technical standards and norms, about which we've been talking previously. Second one is competition policy, where the European Commission has been very active. Margrethe Vestager has been very active over the past couple of years. Abuse of dominant positions, excessive market power, and the like. Analytically extremely difficult. And the third question is that of tax, where there has been a recent agreement at OECD level, or thanks to the facilitation of the OECD, which I would regard as sort of bare minimum, but let's see how that further develops. So there are a couple of ways how one could interpret this question from Bart Keed. And if we simply talk about standards, then I think the answer is fairly clear. Work together with like-minded countries, develop these standards in a cooperative manner, and the more like-minded countries join such an agreement or consensus, the better it is in terms of, let's say, facilitating trade. However, the question is probably meant in a slightly different manner, namely competition. And there, everybody has a certain element of extraterritoriality about them. And it doesn't matter where companies are located, but what the effect on domestic markets are. And there are instances where you have mergers agreed only with fairly clear and fairly restrictive binding commitments, even if one or possibly both of the merging companies were not located in the jurisdiction we're talking about. So there are possibilities. The instruments are here. They are only to a certain extent fully utilized, and on tax and the like, personally, I would like to say see considerable further progress over the next years in ensuring that taxes are paid where final consumption takes place. So voila, there's more than enough work for the next generation of people from the private sector and the public sector to fruitfully cooperate on these issues. Thanks, Heiko.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I'd like to thank all of you, also Dimitri, Alexander, and I'd like to bring this session to a close. There's a very nice saying that whenever the audience becomes hungry of asking for more information, this is the right point in time to stop the discussion, leave them hungry for the next session. I'm really happy that you tuned in. We spent a little bit more than an hour discussing the upcoming geoeconomic world order, its impact for policy making, but also for corporate decision making. We had Dimitri Trenin from Moscow, Alexander Pizarrok from Ukraine, now sitting in the neighboring office in Brussels, and Thomas Wieser sitting in the opposite office in Brussels as well. My name is Heiko Borchert. I'd like to thank the European Movement International and also Raiffeisen Bank International for hosting this session. I hope you very much enjoyed it. Stay tuned. Storms Ahead is the edited volume that the Raiffeisen Bank International has put out on the occasion of this event. It will soon become available via the website of Raiffeisen Bank International. And who knows, we might meet again on this channel to continue our discussion. Until then, take care. Many thanks for tuning in, and have a nice afternoon. Thank you.